All right, welcome everybody to another author chat here on SFF Addicts, and I'm very excited today to be chatting with Victor Manibo. He's a speculative fiction author living in New York City, as well as a queer immigrant and civil rights lawyer, experiences that have directly influenced his writing. And Victor's debut novel, The Sleepless, is out on August 23rd through Erewhon Books. So welcome to the show and a huge congratulations on the release of your debut novel.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Oh, me too. It's a pleasure. And how are you feeling about everything? How are you feeling about publishing your debut?
Pretty good. I've just been told that my finished copies are on the way to my apartment from the warehouse,
Woo!
and I
Nice.
can't wait. Like, I am checking UPS every hour just to make sure, like, I don't miss it. But I'm very,
Yeah.
very excited. There's a little bit of nerves, now
Mhm.
that it's gonna be like out there and people can buy it and read it, and I just hope it's well received. So far, people who have reviewed early copies have been very generous and very lovely with their thoughts and their praise. So I hope that continues on during the full release.
Yeah. No, I'm sure it will. I mean, I read it in preparation for this interview, really enjoyed it. It's been a while since I've had like a good near future sci-fi book to read. The last one I read was The City Inside, so it's kind of cool to be like, okay, go off to New Delhi and experience Samit Basu's version of that,
hmm
and then to pop back to New York, somewhere that I'm actually much more familiar with, and to get your take on it. And it was really, really cool.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I mean, Summit's book, I hear a lot of great things about it. It's on my TBR pile right now, and I can't wait to read it too. Because we're kind of playing in the same wheelhouse. I think
hmm
his book and mine. So
Yeah. And how's life in general? How are you doing? How's everything going lately?
with the launch coming in a couple of weeks, it's been a lot of author events. I'm always happy to chat with booksellers, podcasters, media folks about the book. Obviously, The Sleepless is mostly what most people want to talk about, but just about science fiction in general and how my book is timely, or at least a lot of people seem to think so. I seem to think so, and how it speaks to the moment. Always happy to rant and rave about current events and capitalism in general,
Yeah.
which is a big recurring theme in the book. Yeah, it's been a lot of those kinds of conversations that always like fun and sometimes thorny conversations to have. But when you're talking to book
Necessary though.
people,
Yeah.
oh yeah, absolutely. And I learned so much from readers and from all people who have read the book or have opinions about the book, even though they haven't read it yet. They kind of have like their kind of views on the premise, because
Mm.
it's kind of like people don't sleep. Well, how does that affect things? And people have ideas. People have like, oh, if I was sleepless, this is what I would do, and that's always a fun conversation to have.
Oh, definitely. Well, we're gonna get into a lot of that stuff, the themes and everything, and
Mhm.
also the concept of sleeplessness and stuff like that. But I want to learn a little bit more about you, and I like to ask authors this at the get go just to get a little bit more of a sense of where they came from. But what was
Mhm.
your relationship like growing up with science fiction and fantasy or reading in general?
I think from a very early age, I've been a huge reader, but my love of books and stories really started with mysteries. This is why
Mm.
even though I really love sci-fi, this book is a blend of sci-fi and mystery. I fell in love with Sherlock Holmes stories. I fell in love with Agatha Christie, maybe at a too early age. Like I
Cool.
was reading them when I was like 8 or 10, and people die
It's
in
all
them, and
good.
people
It's
are
fine.
yeah, I know. That was what my parents, my dad's like thinking was like, you know what? My kid can handle that kind of story. It doesn't
hmm
matter. And I it didn't like scar me or traumatize me. It got me really interested in like all these like complicated people and like the puzzles of a mystery story, which I really love. And I love it when things come together, and when there's the reveal of the solutions. I think that's really where my love of stories came in. Sci-fi came a little bit later when I was into comic books, superhero stories, that kind of stuff. I'm a huge fan of the X-Men, the comics, and to this day, I still like love them and collect everything. So yeah, sci-fi for me started with superhero stories, and then eventually it became the classics. You got your 1984, you got your Brave New World, and like dealing with these big ideas was very appealing to me because I was reading them when I was kind of in my teenage years when I was like,
Mhm.
you know, kind of exploring all these like big concepts and trying to
Yeah.
be a little more like smart or grandiose or something. And like
Yeah.
also I wanted to be a lawyer, so I'm like, oh, I love these books because they envision a different world and they're talking about real stuff and real issues, and which is what always attracted me to science fiction, the big
Mhm.
ideas, that obviously the
Yeah.
very rich and complicated worlds, but also the big ideas. So yeah, I mean, I guess in a nutshell, that's my genesis with genre, with stories in general.
That's really cool though, because I imagine it's like, you became a civil rights lawyer, but at the same time, um, your creativity eventually flourished in the form of the Sleepless, and I'm really curious, beyond those grandiose ideas. I know when you're a teenager, you have all these big ideas and like, oh, like I want to
Right.
tackle everything, I want to save the world, blah blah
Yeah.
blah, and then you get hit with a big fucking reality bomb once you graduate. And
Right.
I'm really curious, like, how did that early development from reading mysteries and comic books and X-Men and stuff like that transition into you actually becoming a lawyer, and then you um writing and finally being able to release your own book?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I did want to be a writer pretty early on. Like, I think I was a junior or a senior. I was like, you know what? I want to become a writer. I want to write stories. I want to write novels. My father was like, no, you're not going to do that. You're going to do something more dependable and stable. And like he wanted some sort of like financial security, stability, and consistency for me,
Right.
which I appreciated. So he's like, you're going to law school. And I already at the time had a passion for social issues, and I was also kind of argumentative, you might say. So
Yeah.
like, okay, sure, let me go to law school. I guess that's a good career path for me.
You
So
get
I
to
did that.
argue with for a living. It's good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it gets exhausting at a certain point, and like I've been a lawyer for 12 years now, and I think I'm at the point where I'm like, wow, arguing with people takes a toll on you. But
Yeah.
the thing is, because I did the whole law thing, I'm still doing the law thing, and it's still very rewarding for me. Like, I think I learned more about myself and the world,
Mm,
and I also learned a lot of skills that helped me with their writing. So when I got to a point in my life where, okay, I have a little bit of time, I have a little bit of security, and I have a little bit of like life experience,
yeah.
and I know who I am and how I feel about the world, the state of, let's say with Sleepless, capitalism. Now I feel like I can flesh it out in a story that I would want to read for myself. So that was like kind of the journey. The being in the law really helped. I You mentioned I do civil rights cases, which I do, which is super rewarding. I do a lot of immigration cases as well, which is very
Oh, cool.
important to me
Yeah.
as an immigrant. And um, I tried to infuse that in my writing. And I think if I didn't take this path, I probably would still be writing. I think just the focus, or even maybe the I guess the didacticness of my writing would be
Yeah.
different.
It's really interesting because it's like, yeah, you know, you wouldn't think that being a lawyer would be the kind of thing that might prepare you for writing a book, but then again, it's like you're constantly confronted with experiences and interactions with human beings, and so it's like this really intense learning experience about what it means to be human, or how to like help people. You get to see the good and bad sides of people. You also get to understand like the nuances of language and communication when people might be
Yeah.
lying or trying to tell us, like a false story, like a false narrative in order to get their certain way, and then you as a lawyer have to be the one to navigate all that crap, in order to
Absolutely. Yeah.
create a compelling argument for whoever you happen to be representing.
Right. And we are told when we were in law school, like, part of the job is storytelling, and to some extent it really is. And my experiences as a lawyer helped me in the book, in very concrete ways. Like, in the Sleepless, there are scenes where Jamie, our lead character, interrogates people
Yeah,
and interacts with, let's say, people in authority, or police officers or whoever else, and like the push and pull between an interrogator and someone who's being interrogated, is something that I've seen, I've acted out on both sides of the fence, and it helped me like think about, okay, how am I going to portray this? How is this going to be, as you were saying, compelling? So yeah, those
yeah.
experiences really helped.
That's so cool. That's so cool. And then, you mentioned your sort of focus on capitalism. We'll get a little bit into the themes of it later on, but I'm curious, like, can you elaborate on the broader inspirations for the Sleepless and how that idea came to be?
Sure. So, you know, it was really because I was tired. I had a long week. I went to my parents over the weekend because I think there was some sort of family gathering, and they live in New Jersey, which was two rivers away from where I lived. And I was like, it was a Sunday. I was on the train. Like, oh man, I have like a long week ahead of me. I like, in general, I love my job, but sometimes you're like, I wish I didn't have to go to work,
Yeah,
but I have to, and there just isn't enough time and to do everything that I needed to do, not just for work, but like, adulting in general takes so much time and effort, and I wish I didn't have to sleep. So yeah, it was just like me griping on a train from Jersey to New York, and then I was like, okay, well, what if I didn't have to sleep? Oh wow,
yeah,
that would be cool. And then I was like, okay, well, what if everybody didn't have to sleep? What then? And it
yeah.
was just like a series of what if questions, one after the other, and then the next thing you know, I'm like, oh, this is like a really interesting world. And that was, um, I want to say, a couple of days prior to November 1st, 2017, before National Novel Writing Month. And
Ah,
I was
cool.
like, oh, you know what? Maybe I can make this my NaNoWriMo project. So
Mhm.
so that's how it started.
Amazing. I mean, this is like this book's for all the tired people out there. Anyone who's
I mean,
really
it's
tired.
I've been told that it's very relatable. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
and I think it is. But everybody goes through that, and everybody goes through that because, for the vast majority of people, you do have to go to work. You're employed in a maybe 9 to 5, maybe not anymore because of the state of the world. But yeah, you gotta put in your hours. You gotta get a paycheck, and then deal with everything else that life has to offer. Like, you
Yeah,
know, you want to tend to your hobbies, but you also have to like deal with family obligations, social obligations. You have friends, you have romantic partners, you have pets,
definitely.
and then and like what, 8 hours of your day at least, more than a third of your day at least, is taken by work. And that's, to me, that was like, okay, this is nuts. Let's explore that.
Mhm. And how did you refine that further into, this pandemic that causes hyperinsomnia? But then on top of that, how did you approach using hyperinsomnia as like the foundation for this near future representation of New York, but also, the broader world?
Yeah, I think New York was an easy, you know like, choice, because I live in New York and it's the city that never sleeps, so it's got to be here, right? But in choosing hyperinsomnia, it was me really thinking about the concept of, um, time is money, and people don't have money, but they have time. And if and how do we use time? How do we monetize time? And how is it happening now? How are we right now, like, using the time that we have, even the downtime that we have, to be more productive?
Mhm.
I think when I was starting out with this book, which was now, God, almost 5 years ago, um, there was this whole glamorization of productivity, optimization, hustle culture that thankfully people have begun to interrogate now, or at least interrogate more closely, but it's still there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Especially in the
and
United States, I think, more than
yeah,
anywhere else.
absolutely. Yeah. And it's, I was like, okay, well, this isn't right. Like, there's so much more to life, and also, why are we doing this just so we can earn a paycheck to buy more things that we're told that we should buy by corporations who make money off of us, who exploit our labor and all that? And one of the things about about being a lawyer, that we were talking about earlier, and you reminded me, is that it also allows you to look at institutions and how institutions like kind of interact with each other, how the government, how corporations, how the labor sector, for example, uh, interact with each other. And that was something that I was really also interested in looking at. So I think all those things coming together, I was like, okay, well, this is going to be the setup. Um, Hyper insomniac world, but not everyone, because I wanted the possibility of things getting worse,
Mhm.
to obviously escalate the story, right? Um, and it became a pandemic, obviously before COVID happened,
Yeah.
because I wanted it to be widespread. I wanted it to be global because it's something, because capitalism is global. It's not
Yeah.
something that that you can contain, or like you, the ills of capitalism just spread globally across borders. So I wanted it to be a pandemic, which um, thankfully the book itself isn't focused on the pandemic. But yeah,
Yeah.
that was like a curious thing that happened as I was getting this book out into the world.
It must have been so surreal, just to experience COVID while this book is, like, in the process of, I'm sure, like, writing and editing and
Hmm.
going through that whole publication process and everything, and, I think you brought up a really good point, though. It's like, not having the pandemic be the focus, you set the novel after the pandemic when things are a little bit more, like, established and settled down, which I think works really well. But you mentioned one little thing, which is like the way that capitalism is its own pandemic of sorts. And it's like it has these viral network qualities where it transcends borders and it transcends spaces and institutions and all this kind of stuff. The same way that a virus doesn't really give a shit about who you are, what your health is, what your race, gender, what
Right.
have you. It's like this thing's going to infect you if you are a viable host. And capitalism kind of functions in the same way.
Absolutely. And like, just to use your analogy also, like, it's something that everybody will have their own response to, like
Yes.
their own choices on, like, okay, there is this thing that is pervasive that you, on some level, are affected by, but also on some level, you might have some control over to opt out
Yeah.
in any way, in small or big ways, right? And how are you going to exercise that little bit of control that you have, right?
Right.
And I think that's something that some of the characters make, those choices that I might or might not agree with. But I hope that I showed like a range of like people's reaction to sleeplessness or
Mhm.
slash capitalism.
Yeah, you definitely did. And I mean, that begs the question. You brought it up earlier how doing these different sorts of podcasts and booksellers and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes the question comes up if you would choose to be sleepless. And I'm curious, if you had the choice, would you want to be sleepless? And whether it's yes or no, why would you make that call?
Yeah, for me, yes, I would. I think just time. The things like, I do want more time. I do want more time for myself, because I want to be able to do a lot of things that um, be having to be an adult doesn't allow me to do. I want to spend more time with my mom, my sister, my husband. I want to write some more. Although, to be honest, I don't know that I would necessarily write more. I probably would read more, but hopefully more writing will come of it.
Yeah.
And that's a thing too. It's like, if you had X amount of time, it can be like 24 hours of like waking time, or it could be just like the 16 that most people get. Like, it's really still up to you how you use that.
Yeah.
And like, everybody will have their own priorities and their own values on the best way to use it. I think I would like to think that I would use extra time well, um, but time extra time would be good. My answer is always like unequivocally yes, yes, I would. Obviously, like, Jamie experiences complications in the book. We don't want to necessarily spoil it for the viewers, I guess, but um, whether or not that is a trade off I'm going to make is something we can explore maybe when we're offline, so that we don't spoil it for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. And then I kind of feel the same way as you. It's like I have a son, he's coming up on 2 years old, doing this podcast and writing my own stuff. It's just like I would love more time. And I feel like that's kind of like one of the major conflicts that I have on a day-to-day basis is like how do I structure my time today in the most efficient but um satisfying way because you want a little bit of spontaneity in there. You don't want to be like everything's
Yeah.
so rigid and structured. But, like you said, I don't know how I would be if I were given that opportunity because, someone like Jamie, there are a lot of people in the story who use that time to interact socially. There are other people who gain new skills like learning martial arts or playing video games. It's like there's so many different avenues that people go down. And when it comes down to it, it's just like humans are really good at procrastinating. They're really good at wasting their
Oh my god.
time. So even if we had more time, I'm like,
Yes.
shit, would I really be more effective with all those extra
Yeah,
hours that I got?
exactly. This is why I say, like, I don't think I would write more necessarily,
Yeah,
like, because as much as like all our pursuits bring us pleasure, I think you might have the choice paralysis when you have too much time. Like,
exactly.
then what do I do with all this time? And maybe eventually that sense of like choice paralysis like dissipates the longer you're sleepless, and then you fall into a more like balanced routine.
Yeah.
But maybe you don't.
Get some meditation in, some yoga, some exercise.
Yeah, yeah,
But but
absolutely.
then but then it's like you're in a city like New York and the famous line of New York is the city that never sleeps and I think that was
Yeah.
a really funny play on what the story is about, but also what is going on in terms of the setting and how people utilize the space being sleepless. You mentioned earlier that it was really easy for you to choose New York as your setting, being someone who lives there, but what did it allow you to do in relation to things like world building or character and plot? And why was it for you the best place to set this story and represent the phenomena of
I
sleeplessness?
Yeah, I think New York. It was easy because it's my debut. It's my first novel. Like, write what you know, so it was easy.
Hmm.
But at the same time, New York is still, for the most part, the center of um, uh, finance, the center of um, media,
Hmm.
and entertainment. And Jamie is a journalist. He works for a multinational firm, media conglomerate, and it made sense to me that it would be based in New York. It made sense to me that the HQ of Zephyrus, which is one of the bigger corporations in the book, would be in New York. Boardroom machinations, high finance stakes, and like mergers and acquisitions. This is like, okay, if you had a story that had all those elements, it would most likely be set in New York, and because New York is such a looming presence in everyone's imagination, um, it allowed me to focus on other bits of world building. I didn't have to flesh out the city too much anymore, right? So it allowed me to flesh out the world building in terms of, well, what are sleepless communities going to be like? What are the different factions in our world going to look like if we had sleepless people? Who are the people? Who are the organizations that are going to be pro sleepless, anti sleepless? And what would be
Right.
the different reasons? And so like I think New York almost feels like a crutch in that sense because like yeah, everybody knows what it looks like. I don't have to
Right.
describe it too much. If I say like, there's the Brooklyn Bridge or some other landmark, people can visualize it fairly easily, and I can focus on other things. That kind of makes me feel like, oh my god, you're such a punk using New York as a crutch. But like, but it's true because I wanted to focus on like the again the social aspect of things and the characters who and the institutions that react to the pandemic or the new normal of sleeplessness.
Yeah, and I completely agree. It's like, reading this book, I'm sure you shaved off like tons of potential pages, like dozens of potential pages of just description about the place and the setting that you didn't really have to do because it's like, as someone who's visited New York a few times, I've had the pleasure of tattooing there as well. So I got to see some of the
Gosh.
neighborhoods that are a little bit more like out of the way,
Yeah,
like
yeah, that's
going
awesome.
yeah, like going to parts of Brooklyn that I never would have gone to otherwise. And just getting the sense of like this is the variety that the city has to offer. And I think movies and TV shows for sure also gives such a standardized sense of like what New York is. So it's like you
Hmm.
mentioned the Brooklyn Bridge. People have that in their mind's eye a lot of the time if they're reading a book or seeing something about New York. It's like boom, there it is. I'm all good
Right.
you know? But I think it was really perfect for the story that you're telling that it be more experiential and, you're seeing things through Jamie's perspective and to be able to understand like the minutia of how the sleepless community is integrated into the fabric of this long existing city. I think that's more important than being like, here's this place and let me describe it to you and blah blah
Right.
blah. It's like no, Jamie's just like in it, he knows this place, you know this place, a lot of readers may probably know this place as well, so I thought that was a really, just perfect, accoutrement to Jamie's narrative.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, and I love the city. That's also part of it. Like um, I've been here for wow, 14 years almost. I don't see myself leaving. I hope I portrayed New York fairly. I definitely made it a point to show other neighborhoods and other like areas of New York that some people might not be familiar with,
Yeah.
because the city like is big and beautiful and complex and
Messy.
I have so many New York stories and yeah, definitely messy in the literal and figurative sense. And I have so many New York stories in my head because it's just such a rich playground for the imagination.
Mhm, and for you, being someone who loves New York, wants to stay there, just to get your speculative mind spinning a little bit, but not necessarily in the sense of the sleepless. What would be something that you would love to see in the future of New York in the next like, 10, 20 years? Cause that's the kind of place I go to and I visit and I'm like, well, shit, there's like a lot of infrastructure that's like a bit clunky and very
Yeah.
outdated in a lot of cases. But as someone who's lived there and knows it a lot better, what's something that you would love to see happen to New York in the near future?
Um, this is probably not a super science fictional answer, but
No, no, it's
I
totally
would
fine.
I would love for New York to have a saner housing policy.
Mm,
Housing in New York is insane. There is a huge surplus of real estate of apartments that are bought up as investments that are used as just like line items in rich people's portfolios. Meanwhile, we have so many homeless people, so many people who need shelter, and the city and the state need to do something about it. The Obviously these conversations are already happening. I think there are strides that are being made, but it's not quickly enough. The real estate lobby in New York is very strong, and they do feel sometimes like they have a stranglehold on the government. And development is still, kind of full speed ahead, regardless of the pandemic. I think I read just today the median rent in Manhattan is $5,000,
Oof.
5,177. And that's Manhattan, but like still, like that is a
Mm,
staggering amount.
mhm.
And that's because of the artificial um, reduction in the supply. There is housing, and they're just not being used. They're being held as investment property. They're being
Yeah.
held to be used as Airbnbs, and that needs to change. And that's something that I hope changes really soon. I mean, sooner than 10 years from now or 5 years from now, even.
Mhm. I mean, that hits home for me because I grew up in British Columbia and I lived in Vancouver where I went to
Mm.
university. And Canada, like the big cities in Canada, especially Toronto and Vancouver, are facing a very similar thing where there's just so much housing that ends up, like you say, being part of someone's investment portfolio, or someone from overseas is using that as a way to get their money out of their own country and physically invested into somewhere that's more stable and um likely to retain its value. And it just creates this fucked up twisted market where it's like the people who are actually, you know, from there, or the people who are immigrating there and they need a place to live and they want to invest in the community, it's like, nope, they're shit out of luck and this area is completely overvalued for what is
Yeah,
actually there just because of this crazy bubble that has been
yeah,
fabricated. Yeah.
yeah, and it's nuts, and it does, change also the demographics of the city. It changes the makeup of the people in those communities. And like I said, the most immediate thing is like there are people who do not have housing who you know could use housing, and it's unfortunate. I really hope it changes soon.
Well, you actually did kind of touch on that a little bit in the book, in the sense that the sleepless communities, they're essentially placed in communities or neighborhoods that are more sleepless
Mhm,
oriented. Or Jamie, for instance, lives in this old hospital that has been converted into like a sleepless apartment
mhm.
project, that kind of stuff. So it did slip in certain ways. This this notion in your head. It's just like there's so much land, there's so many buildings, there's so many underutilized properties or properties that are not being used at all. And it's like, how did you know, how would you allocate space for people who are awake 24/7 is a really interesting thing.
Right, because like those people are going to need space a lot. I mean, I also
Less
explore
space
that
for
in the
beds,
book.
less space for beds,
Less
but
space
more
for
space for
beds, yeah.
everything. Yeah.
For everything else, right?
Yeah.
They're gonna need, services. They're gonna need not necessarily amenities, but like, spaces to do whatever it is that they want to do during their waking
Mhm.
hours, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, that was, and this also loops back to, God, why this book started to begin with was like I am tired but I need to work because I need to pay rent, and rent is super expensive. And so like
Yeah.
yeah, this is all just like weaves together, and like my whole like complaint about the state of capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, it's perfect. These like disparate threads that come together in the form of this story, even if it was conscious or not on your part. But I want you to
Well,
tell me a little bit more about Jamie Vega, your main character, your POV.
mhm,
Since Jamie is a queer immigrant, I think second or third generation Filipino immigrant, how much autobiography went into this character and how did you approach creating Jamie?
sure. I think it was easy for me to just make him queer and Filipino because, like you were saying, it's kind of autobiographical, right? Well, it was my first book. It was also NaNoWriMo. So I was like, you know what? I just got to put words on a page. I will fix this later. Um, so that was like, the easy answer, but also,
Hmm.
um, when I was really getting into the story and realizing what I was trying to do, I was realizing that I am writing a science fiction story that had a protagonist that I haven't really seen a lot of. You don't really see. Asian leads in sci-fi stories. You don't see Filipino leads in a lot of sci-fi stories. I know of maybe a couple. Starship Troopers nominally has a Filipino lead, but you don't really see their culture seeping through.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
you have a lot of cyberpunk properties that have Asian or like biracially Asian leads, but none of them were Filipino. That's one, and not a lot of sci-fi books that I read when I was younger um, had queer characters front and center.
Mm.
That's getting better now, and
Yeah.
I'm very happy about that. I'm very happy to be part of that now. Now that this book is coming out, but yeah, I was like, you know what, this needs to happen. This, a queer and Filipino main character in a sci-fi book. This is kind of book that I would have wanted growing up. So yeah, it was the decision became a lot easier. I I'm not gonna lie and say that it didn't cause me a little bit of worry in terms of just like marketability. Whether or
Mm.
not people will respond to this, whether or not the publishing industry is going to respond well. But I was encouraged by everything that was going on. Like I was saying, we already have a lot of really good queer sci-fi, a lot of really good um, BIPOC sci-fi and queer BIPOC sci-fi.
Yeah,
So I was like,
definitely.
yeah, um, yeah, this can happen, this can work, and I can make this work.
Yeah, I think that the tides are definitely changing, and I think we're in the midst of this wave of positive change, and I'm really happy that you were able to get the opportunity to, represent yourself more truthfully in the story, and also get to include like amazing little details like delicious sounding Filipino food, like a
Yeah,
Filipino like Sunday potluck. I'm just like, oh damn, I want that. That sounds amazing.
yeah. I mean, food is a huge part of our culture.
Yeah.
So I needed food in there. It had to be in there somehow. So
Gotta meet the parents. Gotta meet the parents, of course.
yeah, there has to be like a Sunday brunch. It's a big deal.
Oh yeah. And for you, as Jamie's story is developing, we'll avoid spoilers, of course, but there is an ongoing struggle for this character in terms of memory and trauma. For you, why were those sort of like central to this character and their themes and sort of their like thematic arc over the course of the book?
So when I started out, I knew I wanted it to be a murder mystery. There had to
Hmm.
be a dead body, otherwise it's not a murder mystery. And I knew I wanted it to be someone that was close to Jamie, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted an emotional journey. I wanted it on the page. I wanted to show how death can affect someone. And
Mm.
in this book, it really does mess Jamie up, not just because um, of Simon's death, but also because he is a fully grown person who has baggage and trauma to begin with, and how that can be magnified and how that can be complicated by seeing your mentor dead, right?
Right.
um so it was important for me to explore all of that, because I think that makes, personally for me, for a richer reading of just like a mystery. I love it when characters are obviously competent and smart. They might be flawed, they might make mistakes, but I want to be able to like emotionally connect with them and like feel
Mm.
their anguish and their pain and their like doubt and their guilt and all of those emotions. So yeah, I think dealing with his mental health was something that felt necessary to me.
No, I really like it, and that adds so much nuance to the character because with everything that's going on, you know, it adds so much when there's like, okay, there's the murder mystery and trying to figure out all this stuff, but then you get you get the tension of the unreliable narrator starting to
Hmm.
seep in, and the narrator like realizing that they're unreliable and trying to figure out what the fuck is going on adds
Right.
even more tension, and it's great.
Yeah, and like, when someone is dealing with trauma, it does feel like that sometimes. Like you can't trust your own experience of things because you don't know. It's colored by everything that's going on, and when bad shit is going on around you, you're like, "Whoa, is this really happening? Is this real? Am I forgetting something? Am I misremembering this?" And you layer that with an active attempt to remember someone who just died and like trying to honor their memory, which
Mhm.
Jamie, because of his closeness to Simon, obviously he wanted to do that. So there's just a lot there that I wanted to explore. Um and and finally, just going back a little bit to the Filipino aspect of it all, that's one of the things that culturally is, I think, a defining trait some people would call flaw about Filipinos is that um, they, we kind of like say to ourselves as a collective, like, our people have such poor memories because we kind of repeat the mistakes of our history. Our people has a very complicated history with colonization, with dictators, and we kind of, from time to time, revert to bad habits and we forget the lessons of the past. And so it was kind of a theme that I also wanted to touch on. And there's a part in the middle of the book that kind of talks about this a little bit, about how it's one of like the things that make Filipinos, for better or worse, is like poor memory.
Yeah, because I mean, it's like, you know, this concept of collective trauma and how a people deal with it, and I spoke to TR Napper, who's a cyberpunk author, and
Yeah,
he
yeah,
wrote a
yeah.
book set in
He's
Vietnam,
great.
and we
Yeah,
we were talking about this idea of collective trauma of the Vietnam War, and even before the Vietnam War, how there was occupation by China and all these kinds of things, and how
mhm.
culture and um like community, sometimes there's a habit to brush things under the rug, and the idea of like forgetting as a form of dealing with trauma can
Yeah,
end up permeating a society in a much more insidious way than people may realize, even if it's from one generation to the next, even if it's the stories that families tell their children or the way that society represents these things. In the case of the Philippines, it's like, Spanish occupation,
yeah.
um, Chinese occupation, uh,
Japanese. Yeah,
Japanese
but
Japanese occupation, and American occupation, and all these different kinds of things that have interwoven into the fabric of what the Philippines is. But at the same time, how effective is forgetting as a tool of dealing with trauma?
yeah, and like we don't even have to go that far back. Like even in my lifetime, right now, the president of the Philippines, who was just elected a couple of months ago, is the son of a dictator that the Filipino
Mhm.
people deposed in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I was like, what, we're doing this again? Like, what is
Exactly.
going on? This is nuts.
Uh,
But yeah, I mean, it's a good point that you say about collective trauma. It's a coping mechanism. Like on an individual level, it is like I don't know that it's the healthiest, but it's something that definitely does happen,
mhm.
for someone to protect themselves by forgetting, and it happens on a collective level as well.
Yeah, and now that we're getting political, let's dig a little bit more into some of the themes of the book.
Sure.
You've been mentioning capitalism, that's recurred throughout our conversation, but I think you definitely do a good job of tackling a lot of broader institutions, societal institutions like journalism and the news media, with Jamie working for a news corporation, as well as that news corporation being in the middle of sort of like a corporate takeover. You also touch on things like sleeplessness and the technology and pharmaceutical implications of sleeplessness, and how that ends up being subsumed by the capitalist mandate, if you want to call that. But then also there are
Yeah,
things like uh pandemic response, whether it's on a governmental level, but also on like a cultural level, when you have, as you mentioned, like certain groups who are anti-sleepless or pro-sleepless, and how that infuses itself into so many facets of society, whether it's like, you know, a super PAC being funded by by anti-sleepless or
anti-sleep.
pro-sleepless
Yeah.
corporation. Yeah, it's super fascinating. So, what was your approach to sort of um, creating this foundation of the world with Sleepless, but then layering it with these different political commentaries throughout?
I think our current political moment helped me a lot for sure. Just with the journalism angle of it, Jamie works for a huge media corporation, and they're being acquired. That's like what's happening with Jeff Bezos and the Washington
Mm,
Post. We have seen. What I think it's been 5 years since the Post has been acquired. We've seen at least a little bit of Amazon, Jeff Bezos's influence on the pages of the Post, at least in their opinion columns, right? So I think it was something that was definitely top of mind, and that was something that I was able to translate onto the page. Hope not too closely, because you know I don't want I didn't want to draw too close of a parallel with Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the Washington Post,
mhm,
but that definitely was something that I was very conscious of and inspired me. Um, and same with with the pharmaceutical industry and the pandemic response. I wrote the book pre-pandemic, but I was revising it and getting it ready for publishing professionals during the pandemic,
mhm,
and I learned a lot about how what pandemic response really looks like when it's actually happening all around you. That
and
made the
how effective or ineffective it can be.
exactly, and
Yeah.
how pandemic responses aren't going to be decided on like public health considerations. They're decided on like corporations' bottom lines. How vaccines are distributed, like
Mhm,
how what kind of policies we're going to implement in like requiring people to go back to work or saying that it's okay to go back to offices. Like the science is a consideration. Public safety is a consideration, but also um, corporate forces, capitalism, and its many demands are also a consideration. So it was like really interesting seeing that play out, and like me going like, oh yeah, this is exactly what's happening. I think
mhm,
in my initial draft, um, I it was a little more. I think the response was a little more militaristic when I first drafted the book. It was like there were like quarantine camps, and like the National Guard was more involved in implementing like isolation and all that. And then when I saw what was going on with COVID, it was like, okay, that's not necessary. That doesn't feel real, because now this is real, and this is what's happening. But yeah, it the experience of writing, revising this in 2020 definitely instilled in me like, yeah, corporations kind of run the show too, even with a global pandemic that should
mhm,
be about keeping people safe and making sure people recover and that resources are allocated to where they're needed the most,
mhm.
and in prioritizing like getting a hold and containing the pandemic. So yeah.
No, I mean, it was. I'm glad that you had that. I mean, I'm not glad that there was a pandemic, but I'm glad that the pandemic gave you the realization that the response would have been a little bit more subtle, a little bit less like. I think there's like a pre-COVID and a post-COVID idea of like the COVID, or sorry, the pandemic response kind of thing. And it's like all the
Hmm.
movies that we saw, all
Hmm.
the books that we read, the response would always
Right.
be super extreme, like
Yeah.
quarantine camps, like you said, all this kind of stuff. The
Yeah.
National Guard, call in the National Guard. But the way that it
Exactly.
actually happened, it's like a lot of it just kind of came down to bureaucracy and all of its successes and failings and the way that
Yeah.
corporations deal with it. And, I live
Mm,
in Ecuador. And so
mm.
there
Wow.
was a lot of just strange goings on in terms of distribution of vaccines. And there were
Oh,
certain
yeah.
nonprofits that were set up in order to distribute vaccines to third world countries or countries
Mm,
that weren't economically
mm.
capable of purchasing large quantities of
R
vaccine. So I saw all this
right.
shit firsthand, and I'm just like, this is a mess. And me and
Yeah.
my wife are just like, we're gonna stay at home and just avoid people
Yeah,
as much as
yeah.
possible. Yeah.
And there was, like, so much corruption too. I mean, I don't know the extent of corruption in the US. It didn't seem like there was, but, like, maybe we just don't know. But I know, in the Philippines, there was a lot of corruption in terms of, like, who's making the masks, which corporations are making them, how are they getting distributed, who's getting paid, who's getting the vaccines, like, who's getting prioritized. Like,
Yeah.
it was disgusting, like, hearing about it and, like, knowing that people are dying, and it's still about money for a lot of people, and that was the priority, and it was just, like, really disheartening.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why I'm so thankful that there are books like The Sleepless out there, and there's more stuff coming out that for me are ultimately more hopeful. I know there are a lot of hurdles to get over and struggles that the character deals with, and representations of very bad people, but also for me there was a lot of representation of small actors being able to make big impact. And I think that's really important after all the crap that we've dealt with COVID, et
Oh,
cetera,
yeah.
all the
Yeah.
corruption and stuff like that. Like we haven't
Mhm.
even breached the surface of what has actually happened. But I'm
Yeah.
really thankful that there is literature like yours. And after having finished the book, you know, and reflecting upon our own world and all this kind of stuff, what makes you hopeful about humanity in 2022?
I think what makes me hopeful is just the amount of art that's been created. I mean, you already kind of touched upon it. Like, people are responding to the pandemic, not just the pandemic, but also like fascism, police brutality. Like, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a lot of really good, art about resistance, about, you know, let's go back to 2016. Like, ever since, like, Trump got into office, like, we've seen a lot of books and stories and movies and music and theater that, like, really addressed what it's like to live under a fascist rule, under, like, incompetent, corrupt government officials,
Yeah.
what it's like when you have a police state, what it's like when you have a carceral state. Um, you know, I am uh, like continuously inspired by the just the sheer amount of books that deal with this. The Like I said, art, just not just books, that, like, really are coming up because of a sense of, like, we are getting fed up. And I hope it continues. It's for some people, like, they say, um, art shouldn't be that political. I mean,
Fuck that.
that's
No.
obviously
No.
not how that's not my view at all, obviously. But yeah, I think that's what gives me hope. Art gives me hope. Um, the state of artists give me hope. What we touched on earlier, the fact that just in this small slice of art, publishing is becoming more diverse, not just in terms
Yeah.
of, like, um, queer creators, but also creators of color, creators who are, from marginalized backgrounds, from impoverished backgrounds, from, the global south. That gives me hope.
Yeah, beautiful. And on that note, we'll close out. If you could let people know what you're currently reading, watching, listening to, anything that you'd like to recommend
Oh,
to
wow.
people that you're really enjoying.
I am well, I just finished The Sandman on Netflix, and
Ooh,
I am obsessed.
I'm
Have
on
you finished
episode
it?
6. I'm on episode 6.
Okay.
It's so
Oh
good.
my god, episode 6 is so good. I Listen, it's that episode is so good that I have started writing something that is like almost fanfic of that episode because it's so
Oh,
good.
beautiful.
But yeah, I really love it. I think it's got its issues, but overall, I'm like really obsessed with this show. Highly recommend it. But in terms of books, I haven't been reading a lot of books lately because of just busyness. I'm reading a lot of comics.
Nice.
Yeah, the current X-Men run is something that I always recommend to people if you're into comics, or even if you're not into comics. I just love the X-Men. So yeah,
Awesome. Well, Victor, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. And I highly recommend everyone go check out The Sleepless. It's out on August 23rd. And if you could let listeners and viewers know where they can find you on social media and where they can pick up your book.
awesome. Uh, Thank you for having me again. This was so much fun. I
Happy
loved
to.
chatting with you and getting into all those thorny issues.
Yeah.
Everyone can find me online on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Victor Manibo. That's one word, my first name and my last name. Same handle everywhere. Oh, and the
Awesome.
book. You can pick it up everywhere. It's available on hardcover, ebook, and audiobook
Nice.
on August 23rd from preferably your indie bookstore, but all the
Yes.
major retail sites will have it too.
Awesome. Victor Manibo, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Adrian, this was great. Talk to you soon.